when the country was discovered. In the Amazon biome alone, 84% of the forest is pristine, untouched, while homing the planet's largest, greatest biodiversity. May I call to mind that the Amazonian region in Brazil is as big as the area of all of Western Europe. We have brought forward from 2060 to 2050 our goal of achieving climate neutrality, net zero. Human resources and funding allocated to strengthen environmental institutions have been doubled with a view to totally eliminating illegal deforestation. And the results of this important initiative are already visible. In the Amazon region, we have seen a drop of 32% in deforestation in August as compared to August last year. What other country in the world has an environmental preservation policy like ours? Ladies and gentlemen, you are all invited to come and visit our Amazon. Brazil today is already an example in energy generation. 83% of our energy comes from renewable sources. At the upcoming COP26 conference, we will pursue consensus on rules governing a global carbon credit market, and we do hope industrialized countries will actually fulfill their commitments to climate funding at substantial amounts. The future of green jobs lies in Brazil. Renewable energy plus sustainable agriculture plus low-carbon industries, basic sanitation, waste management, and tourism. We have ratified the Inter-American Convention on Racism and related forms of intolerance. We believe that the traditional nuclear family is the very foundation of civilization, and human beings' freedom can only be complete, is only made complete with freedom of worship and freedom of expression. 14% of the Brazilian territory, in other words, more than 110 million hectares, an area as big as Germany and France together, is devoted to indigenous reserves. In these areas, 600,000 indigenous people live in freedom and increasingly wish to use their lands for agriculture and other activities. Brazil has always taken part in United Nations peacekeeping missions from Suez to the Congo, from Haiti to Lebanon. My country has always welcomed refugees. At our border with neighboring Venezuela, Operation Welcome, conducted by the federal government, has already received and welcomed 400,000 Venezuelan citizens who have been displaced due to the serious political economic crisis bred by the dictatorship regime. The future of Afghanistan is also cause of deep concern for us. We will grant humanitarian visas to Afghan Christians, women, children, and judges. As we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the attacks against the United States of America on September 11th, 20 years ago, we repudiate terrorism in all of its form. In 2022, Brazil will again hold a seat at the United Nations Security Council. I wish to thank the 181 countries out of a total of 190 countries that have trusted Brazil to that effect. It is the result, the visible result of a serious foreign policy, responsible foreign policy led by our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We support a reform of the United Nations Security Council where we seek a permanent seat. The pandemic has caught everyone by surprise in 2020. We do regret all of the deaths that took place in Brazil and worldwide. I have always advocated that we should fight the virus and unemployment at the same time and with the same sense of responsibility. Isolation and lockdown measures left a legacy of inflation, particularly in foodstuffs all over the world. In Brazil, to cater to the needs of the low-income population who were forced to stay at home by decisions taken by governors and mayors, people who lost their income, we granted an emergency aid of $800 to 68 million people in 2020. May I call to mind that we came to the end of 2020, the year of the pandemic, with more formal jobs than was the case back in December 2019, thanks to the actions led by our government, such as, for example, programs to ensure employment conditions and income, which have cost us nearly $40 billion. This year, in the first 7 months alone, we created nearly 1,800,000 new job posts. May I also call to mind that the growth rate forecast for 2021 is estimated at 5%. So far, the federal government has distributed more than 260 million doses of COVID vaccines, and more than 140 million Brazilian citizens have already been given at least the first shot, which accounts for almost 90% of the adult population, and 80% of the indigenous population have already been fully inoculated for COVID. By November this year, all citizens who have chosen to be vaccinated in Brazil will be duly covered. We support vaccination efforts. However, my administration has not supported a vaccine or health passport or any other vaccine-related obligation. Since the pandemic started, we have supported doctors' professional autonomy in the quest for early treatment measures, in line with recommendations issued by the Brazilian Federal Council of Medicine. I myself underwent early treatment for COVID. We, of course, respect the professional doctor-patient relations as regards decisions on the proper medication to be used and also the potential for off-label use. We cannot understand why many countries, together with a large portion of the media, took a stance against early treatment measures. History and science will certainly be wise enough to hold everyone accountable. Last September the 7th, our National Independence Day, millions of Brazilians peacefully and patriotically took to the streets in the largest demonstration in our history, to show that they will not give up on democracy, they will not give up individual freedoms, and that they do support our administration. As I have shown, Brazil currently experiences new times. In the economy, we have had one of the best performance levels among emerging countries. My administration has recovered foreign credibility, and today Brazil is one of the best investment destinations in the world. And it is here, at this General Assembly, that we envision a world with more freedom, more democracy, more prosperity and peace. And may God bless us all.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Brazil for the statement just made, and I request the protocol to escort His Excellency.
Coming in from these are of course live visuals coming in from the United Nations General Assembly, the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly that is currently underway in New York in the United States. We are getting reports that US President Joe Biden is scheduled to speak next. We just heard the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro give his remarks at the UNGA. Remember, Bolsonaro's speech has been highly controversial because, of course, he happens to be an unvaccinated president. He refused the UN vaccine mandate, and he still says that he is unvaccinated and has no plans of getting vaccinated anytime soon, even though the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a call to him to get vaccinated. We are expecting the US President Joe Biden to speak next. WION World is One has the biggest team on ground, getting you all the live updates from the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly currently underway in New York in the United States. This comes in the backdrop of tensions, of course, between European leaders and the White House over a scuppered submarine deal, which has now threatened to overshadow President Biden's address to the United Nations. Now, these are arrival shots coming in of the United States President Joe Biden. He has arrived. Once again, these are live shots coming in from New York in the United States, where the US President Joe Biden has arrived to deliver his remarks. We are now expecting the US President to make his address at the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. His speech is, of course, expected as tensions remain high between European allies and the US over a scuppered submarine deal, which has now threatened to cast a shadow over the US President's address at the UNGA. In fact, one EU official has recently said that something is broken in the transatlantic alliance. We have, of course, been getting you reports of what the French government has been saying recently when Australia abandoned a huge deal to buy conventional submarines from France. And instead, now the US and UK have announced that they would help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines, something that has become a bone of contention for France. These are arrival shots of the US President Joe Biden. For all our viewers who have just joined us on WION World is One, we'd like to remind you all that WION has the biggest team on ground. And now, as we can see, US President Joe Biden has arrived
on behalf of the General
for his
Assembly,
remarks.
I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States of America, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow delegates, to all those who dedicate themselves to this noble mission of this institution, it's my honor to speak to you for the first time as President of the United States. We meet this year in a moment of intermingled with great pain and extraordinary possibility. We've lost so much to this devastating pandemic that continues to claim lives around the world and impact so much on our existence. We're mourning more than 4.5 million people, people of every nation, from every background. Each death is an individual heartbreak, but our shared grief is a poignant reminder that our collective future will hinge on our ability to recognize our common humanity and to act together. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the clear and urgent choice that we face here at the dawning of what must be a decisive decade for our world, a decade that will quite literally determine our futures. As a global community, we're challenged by urgent and looming crises, wherein lie enormous opportunities if we can summon the will and resolve to seize these opportunities. Will we work together to save lives, defeat COVID-19 everywhere, and take the necessary steps to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic, for there will be another one? Or will we fail to harness the tools at our disposal as the more virulent and dangerous variants take hold? Will we meet the threat of challenging climate, the challenging climate we're all feeling, already ravaging every part of our world with extreme weather? Or will we suffer the merciless march of ever-worsening droughts and floods, more intense fires and hurricanes, longer heat waves, and rising seas? Will we affirm and uphold the human dignity and human rights under which nations in common cause more than 7 decades ago formed this institution? Will we apply and strengthen the core tenets of the international system, including the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as we seek to shape the emergence of new technologies and deter new threats? Or will we allow those universal principles to be trampled and twisted in the pursuit of naked political power? In my view, how we answer these questions in this moment, whether we choose to fight for our shared future or not, will reverberate for for generations yet to come. Simply put, we stand, in my view, at an inflection point in history. And I'm here today to share with you how the United States intends to work with partners and allies to answer these questions, and the commitment of my new administration to help lead the world toward a more peaceful, prosperous future for all people. Instead of continuing to fight the wars of the past, we are fixing our eyes on devoting our resources to the challenges that hold the keys to our collective future. Ending this pandemic, addressing the climate crisis, managing the shifts in global power dynamics, shaping the rules of the world on vital issues like trade, cyber, and emerging technologies, and facing the threat of terrorism as it stands today. We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, and as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world, of renewing and defending democracy, of proving that no matter how challenging or how complex the problems we're going to face, government by and for the people is still the best way to deliver for all of our people. And as the United States turns our focus to the priorities and the regions of the world, like the Indo-Pacific, that are most consequential today and tomorrow, we'll do so with our allies and partners through cooperation at multilateral institutions like the United Nations to amplify our collective strength and speed our progress toward dealing with these global challenges. It is a fundamental truth of the 21st century within each of our countries and as a global community that our own success is bound up in others succeeding as well. To deliver for our own people, we must also engage deeply with the rest of the world. To ensure that our own future, we must work together with other partners, our partners, toward a shared future. Our security, our prosperity, and our very freedoms are interconnected, in my view, as never before. And so, I believe we must work together as never before. Over the last 8 months, I prioritized rebuilding our alliances, revitalizing our partnerships, and recognizing they are essential and central to America's enduring security and prosperity. We have reaffirmed our sacred NATO alliance to Article 5 commitment. We're working with our allies toward a new strategic concept that will help our alliance better take on evolving threats of today and tomorrow. We renewed our engagement with the European Union, a fundamental partner in tackling a full range of significant issues facing our world today. We elevated the Quad partnership among Australia, India, Japan, and the United States to take on challenges ranging from health security to climate to emerging technologies. We're engaging with regional institutions from ASEAN to the African Union to the Organization of American States to focus on people's urgent needs for better health and better economic outcomes. We're back at the table in international forums, especially the United Nations, to focus attention and to spur global action on shared challenges. We are re-engaged at the World Health Organization and working in close partnership with COVAX to deliver life-saving vaccines around the world. We rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're running to retake a seat in the Human Rights Council next year at the UN. And as the United States seeks to rally the world to action, we will lead not just with the example of our power, but, God willing, with the power of our example. Make no mistake, the United States will continue to defend ourselves, our allies, and our interests against attack, including terrorist threats, as we prepare to use force, if any is necessary. But to defend our vital U.S. national interest including against ongoing and imminent threats. But the mission must be clear and achievable, undertaken with informed consent of the American people, and whenever possible, in partnership with our allies. U.S. military power must be our tool of last resort, not our first. And it should not be used as an answer to every problem we see around the world. Indeed, today, many of our greatest concerns cannot be solved or even addressed through the force of arms. Bombs and bullets cannot defend against COVID-19 or its future variants. To fight this pandemic, we need a collective act of science and political will. We need to act now to get shots in arms as fast as possible and expand access to oxygen, tests, treatments to save lives around the world. And for the future, we need to create a new mechanism to finance global health security that builds on our existing development assistance and global health and a global health threat council that is armed with the tools we need to monitor and identify emerging pandemics so that we can take immediate action. Already, the United States has put more than $15 billion toward global COVID response, the global COVID response. We've shipped more than 160 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine to other countries. This includes 130 million doses from our own supply and the first tranches of the 500 million doses of Pfizer vaccine we purchased to donate through COVAX. Planes carrying vaccines from the United States have already landed in 100 countries, bringing people all over the world a little dose of hope, as one American nurse termed it to me. A dose of hope, direct from the American people, and importantly, no strings attached. And tomorrow, at the U.S.-hosted Global COVID-19 Summit, I'll be announcing additional commitments as we seek to advance the fight against COVID-19 and hold ourselves accountable around specific targets on 3 key challenges: saving lives now, vaccinating the world, and building back better. This year has also brought widespread death and devastation from the borderless climate crisis. The extreme weather events that we have seen in every part of the world, and you all know it and feel it, represent what the Secretary General has rightly called Code Red for humanity. And the scientists and experts are telling us that we're fast approaching a point of no return in a literal sense. To keep within our reach the vital goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, every nation needs to bring their highest possible ambitions to the table when we meet in Glasgow for COP26. And then to have to keep raising our collective ambition over time. In April, I announced the United States' ambitious new goal under the Paris Agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the United States by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, as we work toward achieving a clean energy economy with net zero emissions by 2050. And my administration is working closely with our Congress to make critical investments in green infrastructure and electric vehicles that will help us lock in progress at home toward our climate goals. And the best part is, making these ambitious investments isn't just good climate policy, it's a chance for each of our countries to invest in ourselves and our own future. It's an enormous opportunity to create good-paying jobs for workers in each of our countries and to spur long-term economic growth that will improve the quality of life for all of our people. We also have to support the countries and people that will be hit the hardest and that have the fewest resources to help them adapt. In April, I announced the United States will double our public international financing to help developing nations tackle the climate crisis. And today, I'm proud to announce that we'll work with the Congress to double that number again, including for adaptation efforts. This will make the United States a leader in public climate finance, and with our added support, together with increased private capital and from other donors, we'll be able to meet the goal of mobilizing $100 billion to support climate action in developing nations. As we deal with these crises, we're also encountering a new era, an era of new technologies and possibilities that have potential to release and reshape every aspect of human existence. And it's up to all of us to determine whether these technologies are a force to empower people or to deepen repression. As new technologies continue to evolve, we'll work together with our democratic partners to ensure that new advances in areas from biotechnology to quantum computing, 5G, artificial intelligence, and more are used to lift people up, to solve problems, and advance human freedom, not to suppress dissent or target minority communities. And the United States intends to make a profound investment in research and innovation, working with countries at all stages of economic development to develop new tools and technologies to help us tackle the challenges of this second quarter of the 21st century and beyond. We're hardening our critical infrastructure against cyber attacks, disrupting ransomware networks, and working to establish clear rules of the road for all nations as it relates to cyberspace. We'll reserve the right to respond decisively to cyber attacks that threaten our people, our allies, or our interests. We will pursue new rules of global trade and economic growth that strive to level the playing field so that it's not artificially tipped in favor of any one country at the expense of others. And every nation has the right and opportunity to compete fairly. We will strive to ensure that basic labor rights, environmental safeguards, and intellectual property are protected, and that the benefits of globalization are shared broadly throughout all our societies. We'll continue to uphold the long-standing rules and norms that have formed the guardrails of international engagement for decades, that have been essential to the development of nations around the world. Bedrock commitments like freedom of navigation, adherence to international laws and treaties, support for arms control measures that reduce the risk and enhance transparency. Our approach is firmly grounded and fully consistent with the United Nations mission and the values we've agreed to when we drafted this charter. These are commitments we all made and that we're all bound to uphold. And as we strive to deal with these urgent challenges, whether they're long-standing or newly emerging, we must also deal with one another. All of the major powers of the world have a duty, in my view, to carefully manage their relationships so they do not tip from responsible competition to conflict. The United States will compete and will compete vigorously and lead with our values and our strength. We'll stand up for our allies and our friends and oppose attempts by stronger countries to dominate weaker ones, whether through changes to territory by force, economic coercion, technical exploitation, or disinformation. But we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs. The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution to shared challenges, even if we have intense disagreements in other areas, because we'll all suffer the consequences of our failure if we do not come together to address the urgent threats like COVID-19 and climate change, or enduring threats like nuclear proliferation. The United States remains committed to preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. We're working with the P5+1 to engage Iran diplomatically and to seek a return to JCPOA. We're prepared to return to full compliance if Iran does the same. Similarly, we seek serious and sustained diplomacy to pursue the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We seek concrete progress toward an available plan with tangible commitments that would increase stability on the peninsula and in the region, as well as improve the lives of the people in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We must also remain vigilant to the threat of terror that terrorism poses to all our nations, whether emanating from distant regions of the world or in our own backyard. We know the bitter sting of terrorism is real. We've almost all experienced it. Last month, we lost 13 American heroes and almost 200 innocent Afghan civilians in a heinous terrorist attack at the Kabul airport. Those who commit acts of terrorism against us will continue to find a determined enemy in the United States. The world today is not the world of 2001, though. And the United States is not the same country we were when we were attacked on 9/11 20 years ago. Today, we're better equipped to detect and prevent terrorist threats, and we are more resilient in our ability to repel them and to respond. We know how to build effective partnerships to dismantle terrorist networks by targeting their financing and support systems, countering their propaganda, preventing their travel, as well as disrupting imminent attacks. We'll meet terrorist threats that arise today and in the future with a full range of tools available to us, including working in cooperation with local partners so that we need not be so reliant on large-scale military deployments. One of the most important ways we can effectively enhance security and reduce violence is by seeking to improve the lives of the people all over the world who see that their governments are not serving their needs. Corruption fuels inequality, siphons off a nation's resources, spreads across borders, and generates human suffering. Is nothing less than a national security threat in the 21st century. Around the world, we're increasingly seeing citizens demonstrate their discontent, seeing the wealthy and well-connected grow richer and richer, taking payoffs and bribes, operating above the law, while the vast majority of the people struggle to find a job or put food on the table, or to get their businesses off the ground, or simply send their children to school. People have taken to the streets in every region to demand that their governments address people's basic needs, give everyone a fair shot to succeed, and protect their God-given rights. And in that chorus of voices, across languages and continents, we hear a common cry, a cry for dignity, simple dignity. As leaders, it's our duty to answer that call, not to silence it. The United States is committed to using our resources and our international platform to support these voices, listen to them, partner with them to find ways to respond that advance human dignity around the world. For example, there's an enormous need for infrastructure in developing countries. But infrastructure that is low quality or that feeds corruption or exacerbates environmental degradation may only end up contributing to greater challenges for countries over time. Done the right way, however, with transparent, sustainable investment in projects that respond to the country's needs and engage their local workers to maintain high labor and environmental standards, infrastructure can be a strong foundation that allows societies in low and middle-income countries to grow and to prosper. That's the idea behind the Build Back Better world And together with the private sector and our G7 partners, we aim to mobilize hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment. We will also continue to be the world's largest contributor to humanitarian assistance, bringing food, water, shelter, emergency health care, and other vital life-saving aid to millions of people in need. When the earthquake strikes, the typhoon rages, or disaster anywhere in the world, the United States shows up. We'll be ready to help. And at a time when nearly 1 in 3 people globally do not have access to adequate food just last year, the United States is committing to rallying our partners to address immediate malnutrition and to ensure that we can sustainably feed the world for the decades to come. To that end, the United States is making a $10 billion commitment to end hunger and invest in food systems at home and abroad. Since 2000, the United States government has provided more than $140 billion to advance health and strengthen health systems, and we will continue our leadership to drive these vital investments to make people's lives better every single day. Just give them a little breathing room. And as we strive to make lives better, we must work with renewed purpose to end the conflicts that are driving so much pain and hurt around the world. We must redouble our diplomacy and commit to political negotiations, not violence, as a tool of first resort. To manage tensions around the world, we must seek a future of greater peace and security for all people of the Middle East. The commitment of the United States to Israel's security is without question, and our support for an independent Jewish state is unequivocal. But I continue to believe that a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state, living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state. We're a long way from that goal at this moment, but we must never allow ourselves to give up on the possibility of progress. We cannot give up on solving raging civil conflicts, including in Ethiopia and Yemen, where fighting between warring parties is driving famine, horrific violence, human rights violations against civilians, including the unconscionable use of rape as a weapon of war. We'll continue to work with the international community to press for peace and bring an end to this suffering. As we pursue diplomacy across the board, the United States will champion the democratic values that go to the very heart of who we are as a nation and a people: freedom, equality, opportunity, and a belief in the universal rights of all people. It's stamped into our DNA as a nation, and critically, it's stamped into the DNA of this institution, the United States. We sometimes forget, I quote the opening words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, quote, "The equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." The founding ethos of the United Nations places the rights of individuals at the center of our system. And that clarity and vision must not be ignored or misinterpreted. The United States will do our part, but will be more successful and more impactful if all of our nations are working toward the full mission to which we are called. That's why more than 100 nations united again around a shared statement, and the Security Council adopted a resolution outlining how we'll support the people of Afghanistan moving forward, laying out the expectations to which we'll hold the Taliban when it comes to respecting universal human rights. We all must advocate for women, the rights of women and girls to use their full talents, to contribute economically, politically, and socially, and pursue their dreams free of violence and intimidation. From Central America to the Middle East to Africa to Afghanistan, wherever it appears in the world. We all must call out and condemn the targeting and oppression of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities whether it occurs in Xinjiang or northern Ethiopia or anywhere in the world. We all must defend the rights of LGBTQI individuals so they can live and love openly without fear, whether it's Chechnya or Cameroon or anywhere. As we steer our nations toward this inflection point and work to meet today's fast-moving, cross-cutting challenges, let me be clear. I am not agnostic about the future we want for the world. The future will belong to those who embrace human dignity, not trample it. The future will belong to those who unleash the potential of their people, not those who stifle it. The future will belong to those who give their people the ability to breathe free, not those who seek to suffocate their people with an iron hand. Authoritarianism, the authoritarianism of the world, may seek to proclaim the end of the age of democracy, but they're wrong. The truth is, the democratic world is everywhere. It lives in the anti-corruption activists, the human rights defenders, the journalists, the peace protesters. On the front lines of this struggle in Belarus, Burma, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, and everywhere in between. It lives in the brave women of Sudan who withstood violence and oppression to push a genocidal dictator from power and who keep working every day to defend their democratic progress. It lives in the proud Moldovans who helped deliver a landslide victory for the forces of democracy with a mandate to fight graft, to build a more inclusive economy. It lives in the young people of Zambia who harness the power of their vote for the first time, turning out in record numbers to denounce corruption and chart a new path for their country. And while no democracy is perfect, including the United States, we'll continue to struggle to live up to the highest ideals to heal our divisions. And we face down violence and insurrection. Democracy remains the best tool we have to unleash our full human potential. My fellow leaders, this is a moment where we must prove ourselves the equals of those who come before us, who with vision and values and determined faith in our collective future built our United Nations, broke the cycle of war and destruction, and laid the foundations for more than 7 decades of relative peace and growing global prosperity. Now, we must again come together to affirm the inherent humanity that unites us is much greater than any outward divisions or disagreements. We must choose to do more than we think we can do alone so that we'll accomplish what we must together. Ending this pandemic and making sure we're better prepared for the next one. Staving off climactic climate change and increasing our resilience to the impacts we already are seeing. Ensuring a future where technologies are a vital tool to solving human challenges and empowering human potential, not a source of greater strife and repression. These are the challenges that we will determine what the world looks like for our children and our grandchildren and what they'll inherit. We can only meet them by looking to the future. I stand here today for the first time in 20 years with the United States not at war. We've turned the page. All the unmatched strength, energy, and commitment, will, and resources of our nation are now fully and squarely focused on what's ahead of us, not what was behind. I know this. As we look ahead, we will lead. We will lead on all the greatest challenges of our time, from COVID to climate, peace and security, human dignity and human rights, but we will not go it alone. We will lead together with our allies and partners and in cooperation with all those who believe as we do that this is within our power to meet these challenges, to build a future that lifts all of our people and preserves this planet. But none of this is inevitable. It's a choice. and I can tell you where America stands. We will choose to build a better future. We, you and I, we have the will and capacity to make it better. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot afford to waste any more time. Let's get to work. Let's make our better future now. We can do this. It's within our power and capacity. Thank you. God bless you all.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the United States of America for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. May I request representatives to remain seated while we suspend the meeting for 5 minutes before resuming to hear the next speaker.
We were listening into Joe Biden making his United Nations General Assembly debut as the American president, speaking on a wide range of issues. Let's break it down for you one by one. Talking about the COVID-19 crisis and the urgency to come together and deal with it. Also talking about climate change and how it has dominated his address in a way, especially after hurricanes and floods that were witnessed in the United States. Those are no longer freak weather events. It's become a part of the normal in the United States, which has witnessed those two extremes, be it hurricanes and floods, as a result of climate change. So Joe Biden also stressing on the need to tackle the climate crisis. As far as the nuclear deal with Iran is concerned, talking about how the U.S. is prepared to return to compliance if Iran agrees. A lot to be read between the lines there. Then talking about the Afghanistan crisis and the threat of terrorism. Remember, the attack at the Kabul airport had claimed the lives of 13 U.S. troops. That has, apart from the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, been the reason why Joe Biden has received a lot of criticism from the global community and also domestically over the way in which the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled. Joe Biden calling this a decisive decade for the world, talking about the pandemic as well as the climate crisis, and talking about the urgency with which these crises need to be dealt with. Once again, reiterating that the U.S. is not seeking a Cold War. This is a very important remark which comes in the backdrop of the friction between the U.S. and China as well as Russia. Vis-a-vis the AUKUS deal as well, the U.S. has been seeking to reassure its partners that the AUKUS deal will not take away from other bilateral engagements, from other partnerships, the trilateral engagements, and the Quad engagement, particularly with India. Joe Biden was delivering his first address as the American president. Let's listen in to some key takeaways from that address.
Instead of continuing to fight the wars of the past, we are fixing our eyes on devoting our resources to the challenges that hold the keys to our collective future. Ending this pandemic, addressing the climate crisis, managing the shifts in global power dynamics, shaping the rules of the world on vital issues like trade, cyber, and emerging technologies, and facing the threat of terrorism as it stands today. We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, and as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world, of renewing and defending democracy, of proving that no matter how challenging or how complex the problems we're going to face, government by and for the people is still the best way to deliver for all of our people. As the United States turns our focus to the priorities and the regions of the world, like the Indo-Pacific, that are most consequential today and tomorrow, we'll do so with our allies and partners through cooperation at multilateral institutions like the United Nations to amplify our collective strength and speed our progress toward dealing with these global challenges. It is a fundamental truth of the 21st century within each of our countries and as a global community that our own success is bound up in others succeeding as well. To deliver for our own people, we must also engage deeply with the rest of the world. To ensure that our own future, we must work together with other partners, our partners, toward a shared future.
All right, as we continue to track the latest coming in from the United Nations General Assembly, let's first dissect for you that crucial address that was delivered by American President Joe Biden, a highly anticipated address which has touched upon a wide range of issues. With us is our correspondent Giles Gibson from Brussels. Giles, a better part of that address, Joe Biden was witnessed trying to reassure his allies, the U.S. allies, that America stands firm with its friends and allies who have supported the U.S. so far. That, of course, is a very significant statement coming in the backdrop of the AUKUS deal and the friction that it has caused with the European Union.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that the very first region that Joe Biden, the US president, talked about in this speech was the Indo-Pacific, and then he did eventually get on to talking about the European Union. He called the European Union a fundamental partner and talked about how the US partners with the European Union in all sorts of issues all over the world. But of course, you have to remember the context in which Europeans have been watching this speech from where I am in Brussels, where the headquarters of the European Commission is. That's the building just off to the side of me, because over the last few days we've seen this pretty open split between Washington and Brussels and between other countries around Europe. Of course, heading into this speech, just days before, we had Washington announcing the new AUKUS partnership between the UK, Australia and the US, allowing Australia eventually in the next few decades to have nuclear submarine technology. That has triggered a really angry reaction, in particular from France, of course a key member of the European Union, and France has ended up recalling its ambassador to Washington just in the last few days. And the European Union has also come and backed France in this spat with Washington. We've seen Thierry Breton, who's the European Commissioner for Internal Markets, saying just in the last day or so that something is broken between our relations. So we did in this speech see Joe Biden reaching out to his European partners, talking about issues that they can collaborate on, but certainly one mention in one speech is not going to repair all of the damage that's been done to the relationship over the last few days or so with that announcement.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Giles. Cutting straight back across to the UNGA, where the president of the Maldives, Ibrahim Soli, is speaking.
Today, 56 years since then, as President of the Republic of Maldives, I address the presidency of this General Assembly in our mother tongue. Our mother tongue, Divehi, the language we take pride in and is close to our hearts. A language that is most familiar for the presidency of this General Assembly. The Maldives may be small in size. Maldivians, however, are big in their rich culture and heritage. This is indeed a great honor for our nation. Mr. President, it is highly appropriate that your tenure at the helm of this great assembly is entitled the Presidency of Hope. Because for certain, hope is a highly desirable commodity in these difficult times. And surely what led to the formation of the United Nations? It was hope for a world devoid of the ugliness of wars and famine, hope for equality of all peoples to prevail, hope for justice, human rights, self-determination and democracy to reign supreme, hope of a world where people oppressed under the yoke of colonial rule and other forms of oppression were rendered free. Hope that we preserve a planet, its resources, ecosystems and wonders for generations yet to be born. Mr. President, for the past 76 years, every year, we gather in this great hall and give speeches that inspire us to scale seemingly insurmountable odds to resolve the various problems that afflict our global community. Yet, for all our achievements and success, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed our progress back years. The adverse impacts of climate change are increasing. The steady growth of the world's population is also increasing the presence of famine. And the menace of terrorism remains one of the biggest challenges we face today. This is an ever-present blemish on our common humanity. Which is why my first and foremost duty this morning would be to call on the world community to give our hope resoluteness by backing them up with effort. I believe the 5 rays of hope offered in your PGA manifesto presents great hope in itself, Mr. President. From our small island nations to the powers spanning continents, the consequences of COVID-19 have been the same. It has laid bare in the starkest of terms what we have already known. Namely, that in today's world we are bound together. We must work together in solidarity, in unity, to achieve our ambitions together. Mr. President, for the Maldives, as was the case the world over, the COVID-19 pandemic was a challenge without precedent. Our economy relies on welcoming tourists to these shores. We import nearly everything from food to medicine to the materials we build our shelters with. Having shut down our borders, we were faced with catastrophic outcomes. Tourists stopped arriving, foreign currency receipts dropped, businesses went under. The lockdown hindered social well-being. It set back years of schooling for our beloved children. Our task at hand back then was to determine the best course of action.
As we continue to get to the latest coming in from the United Nations General Assembly, where the Maldivian President Ibrahim Solih is speaking at this point, let's go back across to our correspondents. Siddhant Sibal joining us from Washington, D.C. and Giles Gibson from Brussels. Coming to you first, Siddhant, about the address that was delivered by U.S. President Joe Biden just a short while back, touching upon a whole range of issues, but particularly talking about the backdrop in which this address comes, the AUKUS deal, which has caused that friction with the EU. Also, the US earlier has tried to reassure India that the AUKUS partnership will not take away from either the bilateral engagements or from the quadrilateral partnership that India is a part of. If you can take our viewers through the key takeaways from Joe Biden's address, specifically when it comes to the Indian point of view.
Well, Molly, one of the key focus area when it comes to India was the mention of the Quad. The US President mentioned about the elevation of the Quad, mentioning India in that reference about Quad, and saying that Quad basically focuses on health, on climate and on emerging technologies. He of course mentioned Indo-Pacific as well. It's obviously for the first time that Quad has been mentioned by any US president during his UNGA speech. And of course this year only Quad was formalized. In few days from now Quad will be meeting in the building behind me, and the Indian Prime Minister will be visiting Washington for that. But if you look at the speech made by the US president, he also talked about other global issues, COVID crisis, climate change. In fact, he mentioned Xinjiang as well. This is surely going to rile up the Chinese. We can expect a reaction coming from China very soon over that development. But he also said that US will increase its commitments when it comes to vaccine. Tomorrow, of course, the vaccine COVID crisis summit takes place, in which there will be participation from the Indian side as well. And then, of course, there are a number of bilaterals lined up as well. But this long speech is essentially a speech on as to how Washington engages with the rest of the world. He clearly said that we are back on the table, and talked about how the US government plans to, in a sense, further its policy, specifically when it comes to human rights, on furtherance of democracy. He also referred to Afghanistan as well. In fact, the Afghan Republic's envoy Ghulam Isaaqzai was sitting in the UN General Assembly hall when he was addressing, and there is a big question mark as to who will address Afghanistan. As of now, Ghulam Isaaqzai is expected to address, but remember, he represents the Afghan Republic, the former Afghan government, the Ghani-led government, and so far Taliban hasn't sent any note verbal to UN as to who represents the government now. But clearly, when it comes to the focus areas on China, he did not refer to China directly, but many times talked about how rules-based order has been impacted. He talked about the European Union, the engagement with European Union, and also mentioned about the global hotspots, how crisis is emerging, and talked about how there needs to be a consensus. But largely, this is a statement, this is a policy statement that will be looked forward to for a long time. In fact, it will be dissected deeply, and the entire comment made by him is something that the global capitals will be closely reading as to how Washington re-engages with the world after the Trump presidency.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Siddhant. Let's also get in a quick update from our correspondent, Susan Teherani, who is with us from New York. Susan, very crucial statements that have been delivered by the American president as a part of his debut address at the United Nations General Assembly as the president, talking particularly about countering China, dealing with counter-terrorism measures, the Afghanistan crisis. Those have been statements that have been made in the past, but today's tone and tenor tells us a lot about the direction that America's foreign policy will be taking.
Absolutely. Really, Joe Biden, what he hoped to do was really set the course for a new foreign policy direction for his administration, really saying that, quote unquote, fighting the wars of the past really doesn't make sense. And moving forward, there has to really be a collective collective and cooperative approach in challenges that we have in the future. He really hammered in on the pandemic, and he started by posing questions on which direction the world wants to go. But it was interesting that he really said that we're turning the page. He asked the international community which direction they want to go, whether they want to cooperate with the United States or not. And he also mentioned that America will lead with its allies, that it's up to the allies to really come and cooperate with the United States or not. I think that was very interesting, that he really wanted to set in stone America's leadership role, taking the stage for the first time as the U.S. president. He did talk about Afghanistan. He sort of took somewhat of a victory lap, saying that for the first time as U.S. president in 20 years, he's the one that takes the helm at the United Nations, the stage where U.S. forces are not in Afghanistan, and the so-called war in Afghanistan is over. He did allude to the fact that there was a terrorist attack in Kabul. He talked about differing counterterrorism measures from 2001, saying that the United States is not the same United States as 9/11, that the counterterrorism measures are more advanced. But really, yes, whether directly or indirectly, honing in on China and authoritarian regimes, some say Russia as well, and then wrapping up with, something that American presidents usually do, and that is focusing on America's liberal democracy stance and saying that ultimately that's the way to go. But there is one thing that's important to note, and that's the fact that critics will say, while Joe Biden did focus on a cooperative stance and really wanted to send this message that he is keen on intense diplomacy, at least here at the United Nations.
We've lost that line there with Susan, but taking that point across, Giles, like we discussed earlier, for a lot of the statements that have been made by the American president, one does assess that, like we discussed, he has tried to assure his EU partners that America stands with its allies. In the backdrop of the AUKUS deal as well and the resultant friction, what, in the broad sense, has been the EU stance on the AUKUS deal? We've had some very hard-hitting statements coming in from Ursula von der Leyen as well.
Yeah, that's right. We've seen the French in particular pushing back very strongly against the AUKUS deal, the French recalling their ambassador to Washington as a way of signalling their fury. We've also seen the European Commission and the European Union really lining up behind France in that entire dispute. But listening to this speech, you did hear some echoes of what European leaders have been saying in recent days about climate change. We saw President Biden, of course, no surprise there, talking a lot about climate change, saying that it is a borderless climate crisis, really sending this message that it's not up to individual countries to fight this crisis, but that there has to be universal action, that countries have to get together to fight climate change. And I was covering last week the State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, to the European Parliament down in Strasbourg. And we saw a very similar message from her, talking about how the world needs to get together to fight climate change. And just like Joe Biden as well, we saw Ursula von der Leyen throwing it forward to that COP26 United Nations Climate Change Conference that's coming up in just a couple of months' time in Glasgow in the UK. So we saw Joe Biden, in the same way that we saw Ursula von der Leyen do in her speech last week, really putting the pressure on world leaders to get ready for that crucial conference that's coming up in November.
All right, leaving it there for the moment, Susan Tehrani, Giles Gibson and Siddhant Sipal, thanks very much for joining us with those inputs and details. We're taking a very short break at this point, but that remains our continuing focus. Stay tuned.
The world is finally coming together against China. It's all happening right here in Washington, D.C., the first ever in-person Quad Summit and the Modi-Biden bilateral. All of this week, Gravitas will be coming live to you, first from Washington, D.C. and then from New York. This week will be a game changer for the Indo-Pacific and the world beyond. Join me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, to watch the Gravitas US edition.
One World Trade Center, that is the one where the impact.
The cause of India's freedom for many years.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
America is a constant work in progress.
World leaders converge in the Big Apple. A gripping week of diplomacy, drama, and some fun moments. Follow me, Susan Tehrani, as I report live from the heart of all the diplomatic action. Chasing the biggest story in the world. WION-USA Direct live from September 20th to 30th.
WION, India's global voice, the channel that brings you the biggest stories from across the world through India's lens. Now available in more than 190 countries worldwide. Because we believe that the world is one. Watch us in Africa, Europe, USA and Canada, South America, Asia Pacific, Middle East and North African regions. Also available on these digital platforms across the world. WION. World is one.
Global war on terror. The United States has left Afghanistan to its fate. Now South Asia could pay the price for Joe Biden's blunder. A brutal regime is inflicting terror on Afghans. Terrorist groups are thriving under the Taliban. And a refugee crisis has left 3 million people displaced. How will South Asia deal with an unstable Afghanistan? Watch Gravitas with me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, live from Washington, D.C. at these times, only on WION, World is One.
And welcome back. Thanks very much for staying on with us here on WION World is One. You're watching the latest updates coming in from the United Nations General Assembly with me, Molly Gambhir. A quick look at the top stories.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks and human dignity.
Delivering his maiden speech at the United Nations General Assembly, President Joe Biden, in a reference to relations with China, says the U.S. does not seek a Cold War as he vows to stand up for friends and allies. President Biden says the U.S. would return to the Iranian nuclear deal in full if Tehran does the same, as he urged global leaders to work together to address global challenges like climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and terrorism. UN Chief Antonio Guterres laments vaccine inequity across the world, says while some countries continue to have surplus jabs, many countries are witnessing empty shelves. 90% of African nations are still waiting for vaccines. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the French President Emmanuel Macron hold talks. The two leaders discuss issues related to the Indo-Pacific region as France deals with the fallout from Australia's cancellation of a $40 billion French submarine order. Friction between the US, Australia and European nations over the AUKUS partnership escalates. Germany slams Australia over ditching the submarine contract with France, says it will be difficult to rebuild trust. Sudan's fragile transitional government says it foiled an attempted coup involving military officers and civilians linked to the ousted regime of longtime President Omar al-Bashir.
You are sending us back to work with a clear mandate to get Canada through this pandemic and to the brighter days ahead.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau returns to power in a hotly contested election. Preliminary results, however, suggest Trudeau fails to gain an absolute majority. United Nations voices deep concern at mass U.S. deportations of Haitian migrants, warning that people with serious asylum claims may be at risk as the U.S. moves about 4,000 Haitians from under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas. The European Union chief has accused the United States of lack of loyalty. He says there needs to be clarity about the intentions behind the nuclear submarine deal between the US and UK and between the US and France, that such a move would reinforce European efforts to build their own defense capacity, slamming the US for lack of transparency. He said, and I'm quoting, the elementary principles for allies are transparency and trust, and it goes together. And what do we observe? We are observing a clear lack of transparency and loyalty, suggesting disappointment with US President Joe Biden, who took office vowing to shore up alliances after his divisive predecessor Donald Trump. He said with Trump, at least, it was really clear that the EU was not, in his opinion, a useful partner, going ahead and saying that he had hoped for a better partnership under Biden and his promise of America is back.
During the discussion, the ministers expressed a clear solidarity toward France, and this announcement ran counter to call for greater cooperation with the European Union in the Indo-Pacific.
French officials, meanwhile, continued their diplomatic onslaught. The French foreign minister has accused the US of betrayal and Australia of backstabbing. Le Drian is in New York for UN meetings. However, he has no separate meeting scheduled with the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He calls the submarine deal a breach of trust and has urged the European Union to think hard about alliances.
I will not speculate on the discussion to take place between President Macron and Biden in the coming days. It is important that these discussions take place, but I can't speculate as to the content of the talks. What I can tell you is that it's not just about the brutal, unexpected and unexplained breach of a contract, a 2016 contract that was being implemented. What matters now, first of all, the breach of trust between partners, because partners in alliance means transparency and predictability. It requires explanation. It is about talking to one another, not hiding from one another, in particular on matters of importance. And all of that did not happen, and we need to talk about it.
Ça veut dire se parler, ne pas se cacher.
US President Joe Biden is reportedly looking forward to speaking with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron over the phone. A senior US official has told the news agency AFP that Biden wants to talk with Macron about the way forward after Paris recalled its US ambassador over the deal which killed a massive planned French sale of submarines to Australia. However, the US position on the submarine deal and the AUKUS Pact is clear, with the official saying that Washington understands the French position but not their views. And with us are our correspondents, our London Bureau Chief Mandy Clark. With us also is Siddhant Sibal with us from Washington, D.C. Coming to you first, Mandy. U.S. President Joe Biden, in his address at the UNGA, has given out the larger message that the U.S. continues to stand with its allies. It's a message of outreach coming in from the American president, specifically in the backdrop of the friction that has been caused between the U.S. and the EU over the AUKUS partnership.
Yes, it seems to fly in the face of just what's happened. They reaching out to his allies, and of course, this is what France calls the pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, a stab in the back. And the bigger worry is how those alliances will survive. But one of the most important alliances that the US has, and particularly Europe, is the NATO alliance. And this is very much seen as outside of that. The EU is planning to make their own Indo-Pacific pact now, and it seems almost a fracturing of those essential alliances that Biden just spoke are so essential for the world. So it does seem to run counter to what has just happened. The big question is how they will manage to repair and build trust with France, and if they can continue that relationship. As you mentioned, they have recalled those ambassadors. France is still furious about how the deal was done, and it certainly has the backing of the EU, who are equally angry on France's behalf on how all three countries have acted and announced this pact with no warning. So it seems like a betrayal of the allies, certainly from the European point of view, and rebuilding that will be largely the focus, certainly from the European perspective.
Right. Let me take that point across to Siddhant. The US and France, can they mend those strained ties? Let's also talk about the crucial conversation that's taken place today between the Indian Prime Minister and the French President Emmanuel Macron in the backdrop of the AUKUS agreement.
Well, yes, talking about the conversation between the Indian side and the French side, this is an important conversation. The readouts have been released by both the French side and the Indian side. Key focus on Indo-Pacific, on Afghanistan. There is, of course, no mention of AUKUS, but remember, this is part of conversations which have been happening recently. In fact, just yesterday, the US Defense Secretary and the Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh spoke to each other. There was a mention of AUKUS, but the official readout talked about Afghanistan. But largely, if we take a look at a wider view about AUKUS impacting the Quad, this has been dismissed by the Indian side. The Indian Foreign Secretary earlier today held a briefing ahead of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Washington visit, and this was a question asked many times as to if AUKUS can impact the Quad. He dismissed it, saying that these are two separate entities. AUKUS is a security pact. Quad is basically about diplomacy, diplomatic initiatives. It is convergences of these four countries. And this is formalization, which is going to happen at the White House later this week. But largely, just a short while ago, hours after the conversation between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the French President Macron, both the foreign ministers, the Indian External Affairs Minister and his French counterpart, met in New York on the sidelines of the UNGA. There was a focus on Indo-Pacific. The big focus is that France continues with its stakeholdership, its investment and its increased engagement in the Indo-Pacific. There is, of course, worry now that this can decrease, but this has been reaffirmed now by the French side to the Indian side when they had the conversation earlier today. The shadow perhaps of the AUKUS can fall into the trilateral between France, India and Australia. This is a trilateral which has been working very fast in terms of official level and then graduating to foreign ministers level. The foreign ministers of all these three countries met recently on the sidelines of the G7 foreign ministers meeting in London. Their leaders were expected to meet in Italy on the sidelines of G20, but now it looks like a difficult task given that the French feel betrayed by both Washington and Canberra.
Right. Thanks very much, Siddhant and Mandy, for joining us with those details for now. And as we were discussing, as France's relations with the US take an uncertain turn, the French President Emmanuel Macron called the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi today and discussed Indo-Pacific cooperation between the two sides. Let's tell you more about this conversation, specifically the press release that was issued by the French government. Both leaders reaffirmed their common will to act jointly in an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific area within the framework of the Euro-Indian relationship. France said that this approach aims to promote regional stability and the rule of law, while ruling out any form of hegemony. During the phone conversation, Macron recalled France's commitment to contribute to strengthening India's strategic autonomy, including its industrial and technological base. All of this within the framework of a close relationship, the one based on trust and mutual respect between two strategic partners. Prime Minister Modi has also tweeted about the conversation where he said, spoke with my friend President Emmanuel Macron on the situation in Afghanistan. We also discussed closer collaboration between India and France in the Indo-Pacific. We place great value in our strategic partnership with France, including in the UNSC. The India-France talks coming at an interesting time. France is currently locked in a diplomatic tussle with the US, Australia and UK over the AUKUS deal. The AUKUS partnership is a strategic trilateral between the three countries where the US will provide 8 nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in a bid to strengthen their naval power in the Indo-Pacific and to counter China's growing influence. Just a few hours before the AUKUS was announced, Australia cancelled a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with France, resulting in anger and frustration from Paris. France even called this deal a stab in the back and said that Australia will regret its move. Apart from the Indo-Pacific, Modi and Macron also discussed other pressing global issues like the situation in Afghanistan, a looming global terror threat with the Taliban in power. The two leaders also agreed to hold regular discussions on climate change and to continue their joint actions against the COVID-19 pandemic. During the talks, France also welcomed India's decision to resume its vaccine deliveries to the United Nations COVAX program.
C'est un projet conscient, théorisé.
The United Nations General Assembly kickstarts with powerful speeches and new agendas. From COVID-19 to the climate crisis, a lot was in store as world leaders converged on the UN headquarters after more than a year. The Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro became the first world leader to address the UNGA. A much-anticipated address. A defiant Bolsonaro refused to get vaccinated against COVID-19, effectively challenging the UN honor system. This did not come as a surprise then when the Brazilian leader touted early COVID-19 treatment over vaccines. Bolsonaro has been facing the heat for his handling of the pandemic and for undermining the COVID-19 crisis. Remember, Brazil has the second highest COVID-19 death toll in the world after the United States.
Estamos há 2 anos e 8 meses sem qualquer caso concreto.
Isolation and lockdown measures left a legacy of inflation, particularly in foodstuffs all over the world. In Brazil, to cater to the needs of the low-income population who were forced to stay at home by decisions taken by governors and mayors, people who lost their income, we granted an emergency aid of $800 to 68 million people in 2020. May I call to mind that we came to the end of 2020, the year of the pandemic, with more formal jobs than was the case back in December 2019, thanks to the actions led by our government, such as, for example, programs to ensure employment conditions and income, which have cost us nearly $40 billion. This year, in the first 7 months alone, we created nearly 1,800,000 new job posts. May I also call to mind that the growth rate forecast for 2021 is estimated at 5%. So far, the federal government has distributed more than 260 million doses of COVID vaccines, and more than 140 million Brazilian citizens have already been given at least the first shot, which accounts for almost 90% of the adult population, and 80% of the indigenous population have already been fully inoculated for COVID. By November this year, all citizens who have chosen to be vaccinated in Brazil will be duly covered. We support vaccination efforts. However, my administration has not supported a vaccine or health passport or any other vaccine-related obligation.
US President Joe Biden made his UNGA debut. It was also Biden's biggest international summit since the American departure from Afghanistan. Joe Biden tried to assure the American allies, saying that Washington stands with them and that it was the era of relentless wars that has ended, and now it's time for relentless diplomacy.
Instead of continuing to fight the wars of the past, we are fixing our eyes on devoting our resources to the challenges that hold the keys to our collective future. Ending this pandemic, addressing the climate crisis, managing the shifts in global power dynamics, shaping the rules of the world on vital issues like trade, cyber, and emerging technologies, and facing the threat of terrorism as it stands today. We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, and as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world, of renewing and defending democracy, of proving that no matter how challenging or how complex the problems we're going to face, government by and for the people is still the best way to deliver for all of our people. In other areas,
Biden set new agendas, saying that the U.S. was not seeking a new Cold War and that it was open to return to the Iran nuclear deal if Tehran agrees to comply.
We're working with the P5+1. We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs. The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution to shared challenges, even if we have intense disagreements in other areas, because we'll all suffer the consequences of our failure if we do not come together to address the urgent threats like COVID-19 and climate change, or enduring threats like nuclear proliferation.
And with that, it's a wrap on this edition for now. Stay tuned to WION World is One as we continue to get you the latest coming in from the United Nations General Assembly.
A botch-up has derailed the global war on terror. The United States has left Afghanistan to its fate. Now South Asia could pay the price for Joe Biden's blunder. A brutal regime is inflicting terror on Afghans. Terrorist groups are thriving under the Taliban. And a refugee crisis has left 3 million people displaced. How will South Asia deal with an unstable Afghanistan? Watch Gravitas with me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, live from Washington, D.C. at these times, only on WION World is One.